This is a story about the Great Library of Alexandria in the year 245 BCE, about the scribes and healers, the catalogers and translators, the dock workers and craftsmen who lived in the shadow of that vast collection, and about what it meant to spend your days sorting the whole of human knowledge into labeled bins while the living world outside refused to be so neatly arranged. Let us begin from the sea, because that is how nearly everyone arrived. Picture a ship rounding the breakwater on a morning in late spring, the oars dipping in easy rhythm, the sail half furled as the harbor pilot guides her through the eastern channel. The first thing any traveler would have seen, the first thing anyone saw from miles out, was the Pharos. The great lighthouse rose from its island at the harbor's mouth, a tower of white limestone climbing more than 40 stories above the waterline, its beacon fire burning even in daylight, a column of smoke bending east in the sea breeze. It was, in that century, the tallest structure built by human hands anywhere in the world, and it was merely the city's front door. Behind it, Alexandria unfolded along the coast like a blueprint made real. This was not a city that had grown up over centuries in the organic, tangled way of older places. It had been designed, drawn on paper by the architect Dinocrates of Rhodes, laid out in a precise Hippodamian grid of intersecting streets and measured blocks. 2 great boulevards, each 100 feet wide and lined with stone colonnades, crossed the city at right angles. Beneath their shade, the population moved, perhaps 300,000 souls, perhaps more, in a current of languages and clothing and skin tones that had no equivalent anywhere else on earth. Greeks from every corner of the Mediterranean, native Egyptians who were likely the largest group but held the least formal power, Jews with their own quarter and their own council, Syrians, Persians, Indians, Africans from south of the cataracts, sailors from ports whose names most Alexandrians would never learn. The whole world funneled through this harbor. Frankincense arrived from Arabia, cotton from India, ivory down the Nile from the African interior. Silk, though rare and ruinously expensive, drifted in from the far reaches of China, along routes that no single merchant had ever traveled end to end. And among all these goods, between the amphorae of wine and the sacks of grain, the bolts of linen and the bundles of cinnamon bark, there was another cargo the Ptolemaic kings valued above all others: scrolls. On the northeastern waterfront, behind walls that most Alexandrians would never pass through, lay the Brucheion, the royal palace precinct, occupying nearly a third of the city, and within the Brucheion, nestled among gardens and colonnaded walkways and the residences of kings, stood the Museion, the shrine of the Muses, part temple, part dining hall, part research institute, and home to the most ambitious collection of written knowledge ever assembled. The Library of Alexandria was not, as later centuries would imagine it, a serene marble temple open to all seekers of wisdom. It was state property locked inside the palace compound, funded by royal treasure and governed by a priest appointed by the king himself. Its purpose was not generosity. Its purpose was possession. Under the current king, Ptolemy III Euergetes, a man of considerable intellect and even more considerable appetite, the library's hunger had become legendary. Royal agents fanned out across the Mediterranean with sacks of silver, buying every manuscript they could find. Ships entering the harbor were boarded and searched. Any scrolls found aboard were confiscated, copied by the library's army of scribes, and the originals kept. The copies returned to their bewildered owners. Ptolemy III had recently borrowed the original manuscripts of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from Athens, posting an enormous deposit of 15 talents of silver as surety. He then kept the originals, sent back copies, and cheerfully forfeited the deposit. The Athenians were still angry about it. This appetite had consequences. It created a black market in forged manuscripts, artificially aged papyrus, invented attributions, fraudulent lost works of famous authors offered to royal agents at premium prices. It required a small army of copyists working in shifts, their reed pens scratching across papyrus from dawn until the oil lamps guttered at night. And it demanded, above all else, a system, a way to organize the hundreds of thousands of scrolls accumulating in the library's wooden pigeonholes so that any given text could be found, identified, and retrieved. That system was the Pinakes, the great catalogue begun by the poet Callimachus a generation earlier, a bibliographic survey of all Greek literature that filled 120 volumes. Each entry recorded the author's name and birthplace, a brief biography, a list of works, the opening line of each text, and any doubts about its authenticity. Painted tablets hung above the scroll bins, marking subjects and subdivisions. First letter alphabetical order, a system so new that Callimachus's predecessor Zenodotus may have been the first person in history to use it, governed the arrangement. The Pinakes was the skeleton key to all that the library contained. It was also necessarily a system of choices. Every scroll had to go somewhere. Every text had to be assigned a category, a label, a place in the order of things. And within this vast machine of acquisition and classification, there were people, not the famous scholars whose names survived the centuries, but the workers, the sorters, the translators, the hands and eyes that kept the system running, whose daily labor was the sorting itself, whose lives were shaped by the question of where things belonged. 3 of them, in particular, will walk with us through the seasons of this single Alexandrian year. A cataloguer who has spent 20 years shelving the knowledge of the world and is beginning very quietly to wonder what the shelving leaves out. A young translator who carries 2 languages in her body and crosses between 2 worlds every day, and a healer in the Egyptian quarter whose knowledge has never been written down in any scroll the library would recognize, and who has never once needed it to be. Their lives will brush against one another gently, the way lives do in a city of 300,000, not through dramatic collision, but through the ordinary channels of work and neighborhood and need. And the story they make together is a quiet one, told in ink stains and herb dust and the long walk home through changing streets. The morning light falls across the harbor. The spring fleet rides at anchor. Somewhere inside the palace walls, a man is already walking the colonnaded peripatos with a wax tablet under his arm, and the day's first scrolls are waiting to be opened. His name is Nicandros, and he has been awake since before the sun cleared the harbor wall. This is not unusual for him. 20 years of the same work have carved a channel in his body's rhythms, so that he rises in the dark the way water finds a groove in stone, without deciding, without effort. His small room in the Mausion's residential quarters faces east toward the sea, and on spring mornings the light arrives first as sound, the creak of rigging from the harbor below, the slap of waves against the stone quays, the distant cry of a gull, then the pale band of gray along the horizon. Then, slowly, warmth. He dresses in the near dark, a linen chiton, the fabric softened by years of washing to a texture like skin, a lighter hymation draped loosely for the cool morning air. He will shed it by midday when the heat builds. His sandals are worn smooth at the heel, shaped precisely to his gait. He tucks a reed pen, a callimachus, its tip split to a fine writing point, behind his right ear, the way another man might carry a tool of his trade, and picks up the wax tablet he prepared the night before. On it, in his small, precise hand, he has listed the identification numbers of 14 scrolls that arrived last week from a confiscated shipment and are now waiting for classification. 14 scrolls, a morning's work, perhaps a day's, depending on what surprises they hold. He steps out into the peripatos, the long colonnaded walkway that connects the Mauseon's residential wing to its working spaces, and the air meets him. Salt from the Mediterranean, carried on a breeze that moves between the columns. The faint, dry sweetness of papyrus always present here, the way the smell of grain is present near a mill. And beneath both, the thin smoke of olive oil lamps, already lit in the reading rooms by the night attendants. The columns cast long shadows in the early light, striping the stone floor in bars of blue and pale gold. To his left, between the columns, the harbor is visible, the masts of 100 ships, the dark bulk of a grain freighter being loaded, and beyond it all the open sea, flat and silver in the dawn. Let us follow him inside. The scroll storage area is not a single grand hall. The popular imagination has always been kinder to the library than its architecture warranted. It is, instead, a series of connected rooms, some large, some narrow, their walls lined floor to ceiling with wooden shelving divided into pigeonholes. Each pigeonhole holds one or several papyrus rolls, stored upright with their ends facing outward. Hanging above each section of shelving is a painted wooden tablet. These are the Pinakes tablets, and they are the visible face of Callimachus's great catalogue. Each tablet carries in careful lettering the subject designation for the scrolls below it: epic poetry, lyric poetry, tragedy, comedy, history, rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and many finer divisions besides. The system organizes by first letter of the author's name, alpha, beta, gamma, but only the first letter. Beyond that, order is a matter of institutional memory, and Nicandros carries 20 years of it in his head. The air in here is close, dry, faintly dusty. The smell of papyrus is stronger, that grassy vegetal scent, not unpleasant but persistent, like standing in a field of cut reeds. Beneath it, the sharper tang of ink, the soot and resin mixture used for black text, the ochre-based preparation for red titles and corrections. The lamps here are kept low to reduce fire risk, and the light is supplemented by narrow windows set high in the walls, angled to catch the morning sun without admitting direct heat. The effect is of perpetual, even illumination, a working light, not a beautiful one. Nicandros sets his wax tablet on the slanted reading table and retrieves the first scroll from the intake shelf. He handles it with the unconscious precision of long practice, one hand on each wooden rod, the roll supported from below, never gripped by the papyrus itself. He unrolls it gently, left rod to right, exposing the first column of text. The first line of a scroll functions as its identification. its title in effect, since ancient texts do not carry title pages as later books will. Nicandros reads it, murmurs it to himself. Reading in the ancient world is almost always reading aloud, even when one is alone, and checks it against his wax tablet, a copy of Euripides, the Bacchae. He has shelved 6 copies of this play in his career, and knows the first line as well as he knows his own name. He makes a brief notation on the tablet, re-rolls the scroll carefully to its beginning. It is bad manners and bad practice to leave a scroll wound to the end, forcing the next reader to rewind before finding the title, and places it in the appropriate pigeonhole under tragedy, in the section for authors beginning with epsilon, 1 down, 13 to go. The work has its own rhythm, and Nicandros settles into it the way a rower settles into the stroke. Unroll, read the first line, identify, cross-reference against the Pinakes notation, decide on placement, re-roll, shelve, note. Each step has a small, satisfying precision to it, and he performs them all with the economy of a man for whom this labor has become an extension of thought rather than a prelude to it. His hands are stained at the fingertips, the left thumb and first 2 fingers darkened with ink, a permanent occupational mark that no amount of pumice scrubbing will fully remove. His posture, after 2 decades of bending over tables and reaching into high shelving, carries a slight forward curve at the upper back, not painful yet, but visible, the body reshaping itself around the demands of the work. Most of the 14 scrolls are straightforward, a mathematical treatise in the style of Euclid, a second copy of a geographical text already well represented in the collection, a set of rhetorical exercises that he shelves under rhetoric without hesitation. His calamos comes out from behind his ear periodically to scratch a marginal note on a small scrap of ostrakhan, a pottery shard cheaper than papyrus, used for the rough jottings that scholarship requires before committing anything to the permanent record. Then the 11th scroll. He unrolls it and finds that the text is not entirely in Greek. The body is Demotic Egyptian, the everyday script of the Egyptian population, distinct from the formal hieroglyphs of temples and monuments. But someone has added Greek annotations in the margins in a different hand, as though a previous reader attempted a partial translation. The first line, which Nicandros sounds out slowly, his demotic is functional but imperfect, learned on the job rather than in any formal schooling, suggests a text on dream interpretation. He reads further. The Greek marginalia help. The text appears to contain instructions for interpreting specific types of dreams, linked to prescriptions for herbal remedies to counteract the ill fortune the dreams portend, interwoven with invocations to Thoth, the ibis-headed god of knowledge and writing. Nicandros pauses. It is a familiar problem, though it never stops being a problem. The library's classification system asks, what is this text? Is it medicine? It contains dosages and plant names. Is it religion? It contains prayers and divine invocations. Is it divination? Its explicit purpose is the interpretation of dreams. In its original context, in the hands of whoever wrote it, in the temple or household where it was used, these were not separate categories. They were one practice, as unified as a river is unified despite containing water, current, and silt. But the Pinakes does not have a pigeonhole labeled unified practice. Every scroll must go somewhere. Every text must fit a heading. Nicandros turns the scroll in his hands. He considers divination, a subcategory that is already overstuffed and underconsulted. He considers medicine, where it might be useful to the physician scholars, but where the religious content would be treated as irrelevant noise. He considers setting it aside for a specialist. But the intake shelf is long, and the system expects its returns. He shelves it under divination with a brief cross-reference note on his wax tablet. It is the reasonable choice. It is also, in some way he does not pause to examine, a small act of erasure, the flattening of a thing that was round. He rolls the scroll back to its beginning, places it in the pigeonhole, and reaches for the 12th. The bronze bell in the refectory corridor rings, the communal breakfast. Nicandros straightens, and the vertebrae in his upper back produce a small, audible protest. He tucks the calamos behind his ear, wipes his ink-stained fingers on a scrap of linen he keeps in his belt, and walks toward the domed dining hall, where the morning light falls across bread and olives and the low murmur of Greek conversation. He takes his place at the common table among the scholars and scribes of the Mausion, men who eat for free, who live without tax or rent, whose only obligation is to think and teach and produce. Nicandros eats, bread still warm, a handful of dark olives sharp with brine, a piece of white cheese. He pours diluted wine from a shared pitcher and listens to the conversation flowing around him. Something about the precession of equinoxes, a disagreement over a reading of Aratus. The domed ceiling carries the sound upward and returns it softened, a gentle echo of many voices layered together. He eats steadily, not hurrying, and his mind is already half returned to the stacks, to the remaining 3 scrolls, to the small, nagging feel of a thing improperly placed, the dream text sitting in its pigeonhole under divination like a bird in the wrong nest, alive, but not quite settled. He does not mention it to anyone at the table. It is not the kind of thing one mentions. It is not a problem. It is a classification decision, competently made, perfectly defensible. He finishes his bread, drains his wine, and rises. And now, let us leave Nicandros for a time. Let us step out of the Mausion's colonnaded cool, through the palace gates, and south into the city. The morning is advancing, the sun climbing above the harbor, and the grid of Alexandria's great streets is filling with light and noise, and the movement of 300,000 lives. If we follow the broad avenue south and then turn west, away from the Greek quarter's columned facades, the streets begin to narrow, the language in the air begins to change, and the smell of bread baking in clay ovens rises from a quarter that was old before Alexander ever drew his city's plan upon the sand. Rakotis does not announce itself. There is no gate, no marker, no line scratched into the paving stones where one quarter ends and another begins. But you would know the crossing even with your eyes closed. The stone underfoot changes from the smooth granite slabs of the canopic way to rougher, older surfaces, patched and worn by generations of feet that walked here long before any Greek architect arrived with his measuring rods and right angles. The air changes too. The salt and marble coolness of the Bruchillon gives way to something warmer, denser, more layered. Bread baking in clay ovens that have been fired since before dawn. The sharp ammoniac bite drifting from a tannery 2 streets over, the green smell of canal water from the channel that connects to Lake Mariotis, carrying both commerce and waste in equal measure. And the sound changes most of all. The Koine Greek of the colonnaded avenues, clipped, precise, the language of administration and philosophy, thins and dissolves, replaced by the rounder vowels and softer consonants of Demotic Egyptian, spoken freely here, without apology, without translation, in the quarter that was called Rakotis when it was a fishing village, and is called Rakotis still. Here, in a narrow street where the upper stories lean close enough that neighbors could pass a cup of beer between windows, there is a ground-floor room that opens onto a small courtyard. The courtyard has a single fig tree, old and patient, its branches throwing dappled shadows across a stone basin where rainwater collects. The room itself is Merit's, her home, her workspace, and the place where the neighborhood comes when something in the body goes wrong. Let us step inside. The ceiling is low, the walls plastered and whitewashed, and from the wooden beams overhead hang bundles of dried plants, thyme and mint in tight sheaves, coriander gone to seed, clusters of something sharper and more pungent that the Greek scholars at the library would struggle to name because it exists in a vocabulary they have never learned. Clay jars line a shelf along the far wall, each one stoppered with wax and marked in Demotic with a brush stroke that identifies its contents: ointments, tinctures, dried preparations ground to powder. A low workbench occupies the center of the room, its surface stained with years of use, scarred by knife marks, smooth where hands and arms have rested against it 10,000 times. And in the corner, on a small wooden shelf set into the wall, there stands the household altar. He is perhaps a 4 arms length tall, carved from dark wood worn glossy by touch. Bes, the protector, the dwarf god with his bow legs and his lion's mane and his fiercely bearded face, grinning his terrible grin. To anyone unfamiliar he might seem monstrous, even comical. But in this room, in this quarter, in the homes of ordinary Egyptians from the poorest to the wealthiest, Bes is the most beloved figure on any shelf. His grotesque appearance is the point. He is the face that frightens misfortune away from the threshold, that guards the bedroom and the birthing chamber, that watches over children in the dark. Beside him stands Tuaret, the great hippopotamus goddess, upright on her hind legs, her crocodile tail curving behind her, her lion's paws resting on the symbol of protection. She is the guardian of mothers and infants, the one who stands between a laboring woman and the dangers of the threshold between life and death. Between the two figures small offerings have been placed, a crust of bread gone dry, a few flowers from the courtyard fig tree, curled and fading but not yet removed. Merit rises before the full heat of the day. She is perhaps 55, though she has never calculated the number precisely, and her body carries the particular economy of a woman who has used her hands for decades in work that matters. She is not tall. Her hair, streaked with gray, is pulled back from her face and pinned with a bone clasp. Her fingers are scarred, small nicks from years of fine knife work, a burn mark on the left palm from a preparation that spattered, calluses on the pads of her thumbs where the mortar is gripped. She moves through her mourning in a rhythm so deeply worn that it has become invisible to her, as natural and unexamined as breathing. First, the altar. She pours a small measure of barley beer from a clay cup. Thick beer, the everyday kind, nutritious and faintly sweet, the drink that has sustained Egyptian workers since before anyone alive can remember. The splash darkens the wood at the base of the figures. She murmurs a formula, not a prayer exactly, not in the way a Greek philosopher might understand the term, but a practiced sequence of words that acknowledges the god's presence and asks, without elaboration, for a steady day. The formula is old. It was taught to her by the woman who taught her everything, Tainafret. And Tainafret learned it from her own teacher before that, a chain of murmured mornings stretching back further than the library's oldest scroll. Then the work begins. She takes the stone mortar from its place on the bench, a heavy thing smooth inside from years of grinding, and begins preparing the day's first mixture. Thyme leaves, dried and crumbled between her fingers, releasing their sharp green scent. A measure of honey from a sealed jar, thick dark honey from bees that feed on the wildflowers near Lake Mareotis. She grinds them together with a slow, circular motion, adding a few drops of castor oil to bind the paste, and the smell in the room shifts and deepens, becoming warm and medicinal, the smell of a place where healing happens not through theory, but through the specific knowledge of what this plant does to this body under these conditions. The mortar she uses was Tainafret's. The knife that hangs from a leather loop on the wall, a small curved blade for trimming stems and scraping bark, was Tainafret's. The particular way the herb bundles are hung from the beams, angled so that air circulates evenly through each sheaf, preventing mold in the humid coastal climate. This method was Tainafret's, and Merit has never changed it, not because she is sentimental, but because it works. Tainafret is present in this room the way a foundation is present in a house, not seen, not spoken of, but holding everything up. A sound at the courtyard entrance. Merit looks up. A woman from the neighborhood has arrived, older, her face lined with worry that has settled into permanent grooves, carrying a small child on her hip. The child is perhaps 3 years old, and even from across the room Merit can hear the cough, a wet, rattling sound that speaks of something deep in the chest, something that has been there too long. The grandmother begins to explain, her demotic rapid and anxious, but Merit is already setting down her mortar and wiping her hands on a cloth, already moving toward the child with the unhurried attentiveness that is the hallmark of her practice. She takes the child gently, settles him on the workbench on a folded cloth, and begins to examine. Her hands press lightly against the small chest, feeling for the vibration of the cough beneath the ribs. She listens, not with any instrument, but with her ear close to the child's back, her eyes half closed in concentration. She feels the throat, the glands beneath the jaw. She asks the grandmother questions. When did it begin? Is it worse at night or in the morning? Has there been fever? Does the child eat? The grandmother answers, and Merit listens to the answers with the same quality of attention she gave to the child's breathing, sorting the useful from the frightened, gently redirecting when the grandmother begins to spiral into worry about evil influences and unlucky days. The diagnosis, when it comes, is quiet and specific. A chest congestion, worsened by the damp air off the canal. Not dangerous yet, but persistent enough to need treatment. Merit prepares a mixture, the honey and thyme she was already grinding, to which she adds a measure of something from one of the sealed jars, something whose demotic name means roughly the breath opener, though no Greek equivalent exists in any text the library holds. She spoons the mixture into a small clay vessel, stoppers it, and gives the grandmother careful instructions, a fingertip's worth in warm water, 3 times daily, and keep the child's sleeping area dry and elevated. The grandmother pays a few small coins, the standard fee for a neighborhood consultation. and leaves with the child, who has already stopped crying and is watching Merritt with the round, solemn gaze of a 3-year-old who has encountered competence and found it reassuring. Merritt watches them go. She washes the mortar. She returns to her bench. The morning light has shifted, coming now through the courtyard entrance at a lower angle, catching the dust motes that hang in the still air of the workroom. She picks up the curved knife, Tanifret's knife, and begins trimming a fresh bundle of herbs for drying, her hands moving with the settled, unhurried precision of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing and expects to go on doing it for a long time yet. The fig tree in the courtyard makes a small sound, a single dry leaf releasing and falling, and from somewhere beyond the rooftops, carried on the warm air from the east, there comes the faint, ceaseless murmur of the harbor where the morning trade is already reaching its full roar. The harbor of Alexandria in late spring is a world unto itself, louder and more restless than anything the grid of streets contains. Let us follow the sound now, down from the rooftops of Rakotis, past the warehouses that line the southern edge of the great port, and out onto the stone quays where the Mediterranean opens before us. The quays are enormous, long arms of dressed limestone reaching into the harbor, wide enough for 2 ox carts to pass abreast. At mid-morning, every berth is occupied, the masts of merchant vessels crowding the skyline like a leafless forest, the harbor water slapping dark between their hulls. The smell is layered, almost physical, salt water and pitch, the sharp sweetness of frankincense leaking from a cracked amphora, the dense warmth of sesame being unloaded in burlap sacks, and beneath it all the mineral scent of the keystones themselves, baked by decades of sun and spray. The sound is broader still, sailors calling in Aramaic and Phoenician and 6 dialects of Greek, dock workers chanting in Demotic as they haul on ropes, the crash of amphorae being stacked, and occasionally the sharper sound of one breaking, and somewhere a child, some dock worker's son, barefoot and quick, darting between legs with a basket of figs for sale. Into this, with the easy stride of a man who has long since stopped noticing the noise, walks Doros. He is not a large man, but he carries himself with the particular authority of someone who represents the crown without needing to announce it. His clothing is practical, a short linen chiton belted at the waist, the hem stopping above the knee for ease of movement. His sandals are worn nearly flat by salt water and stone, the leather straps darkened and supple from years of use. Over one shoulder he carries a leather satchel, its flap secured with a bone toggle, and inside it are the tools of his specific trade: a set of wax tablets hinged with cord, a stylus, a small bronze seal stamped with the mark of the Royal Library Administration, and a folding knife for cutting cord on bundled documents. His hands are rough-palmed, tanned dark from the sun, and his forearms carry the faint pale scars that come from decades of handling rope and crate edges on a working waterfront. Doros is a book agent, though that title, in Greek, carries more weight than the English translation suggests. He is a bibliopoles in the service of the Ptolemaic state, one of perhaps a dozen men whose daily task is the execution of a remarkable royal decree that every vessel entering the harbor of Alexandria must surrender any manuscripts found aboard. The originals are taken to the library, copies are made and returned to the owners. The system is efficient, unapologetic, and, depending on your perspective, either the greatest act of cultural preservation in human history or one of its most brazen thefts. Doros does not trouble himself with such distinctions. He has a job, and he does it well. This morning, he is working the Eastern Quay, where the Syrian and Phoenician traders berth. He has already boarded 2 vessels before the sun reached its current angle, one carrying nothing but grain and lentils, the other yielding a single battered scroll of Hesiod's works and days that the ship's navigator had been using improbably as a personal reading copy. Doros confiscated it with a smile and a promise. A clean new copy within the week, better than the one the navigator had been unrolling with fish oil fingers for the past 3 sailing seasons. Now he approaches a 3rd vessel, a broad-beamed merchantman flying Syrian colors, its hull dark with fresh pitch, riding low in the water with a heavy cargo. The captain meets him at the gangplank. He is a weathered man with a plaited beard and the permanently squinting eyes of someone who has spent decades watching horizons. He knows the protocol. Every captain who trades in Alexandria does, and his expression as Doros boards is one of practiced patience, the face of a man enduring a familiar inconvenience. Doros moves through the cargo hold with the efficiency of long habit, his eyes scanning the stacked goods. Amphorae of wine from the Phoenician coast, their stoppers sealed with beeswax, bolts of dyed wool, a crate of copper ingots, bundles of cinnamon bark whose scent fills the close air of the hold with a warmth that seems almost audible, and there, tucked between 2 bales of linen wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of scrolls. The captain explains. They are personal correspondence, he says, letters from his brother in Antioch. Nothing of interest to the library. Doros unwraps the bundle with careful hands and examines the contents. His literacy is functional rather than scholarly. He cannot parse the finer points of Attic prose or identify a rare dialect by its orthography, but he has spent 20 years learning to read the physical properties of manuscripts, and his eye is sharp. He checks the papyrus itself, its weight, its color, the quality of its surface. He examines the binding technique, how the sheets are joined, whether the paste is fresh or aged, whether the wooden rods at each end are original or replacements. He notes the ink, its density, its sheen, the way it sits on the fibers. These are the tells. A genuine old manuscript has a particular relationship between its materials, the papyrus slightly brittle, the ink sunk deep into the fibers, the binding paste darkened with true age rather than stained with smoke or tea to simulate it. The forgery trade, which the library's own appetite has created, produces manuscripts that look old on first glance but betray themselves under this kind of physical scrutiny. 2 uniform, aging, suspiciously ancient scripts written with a contemporary hand's pressure patterns, binding paste that smells of last month rather than last century. Today the bundle holds 5 scrolls. 3 are indeed personal letters. Doros can tell by their informal hand, their short length, and the domestic content visible in the opening lines. He sets these aside. The 4th is a copy of Herodotus, well used, nothing special. He confiscates it, routine, another copy for the ever-growing collection. The 5th gives him pause. It is written in a script he does not recognize, not Greek, not Aramaic, not the Demotic Egyptian he has learned to identify by sight, if not to read. The characters are dense and angular, the papyrus of a different weight than Egyptian stock. He holds it to the light from the hatch. The captain says he acquired it in a port on the Levantine coast from a trader who claimed it was Babylonian. Astronomical tables, the trader said, or perhaps mathematical. The captain is vague. He bought it on a whim, thinking it might be worth something in Alexandria. Doros wraps it carefully, makes a notation on his wax tablet. Unknown script, possibly astronomical, acquired Levantine coast, requires specialist identification, and adds it to the Herodotus. He stamps the captain's cargo manifest with the Royal Library seal, confirms the copying timeline for the Herodotus, and descends the gangplank with the 2 confiscated scrolls in his satchel. On the quay, he hands both scrolls to a runner, a young man, barely 20, who carries a reed basket lined with clean linen specifically for this purpose, and gives instructions. The Herodotus to the main scriptorium for standard copying, the unknown text to the classification desk with a note requesting linguistic identification. The runner departs at a trot, weaving through the dock traffic with the practiced agility of someone who makes this journey 6 times a day. Doros watches him go, then finds a spot on a coil of mooring rope in a patch of shade cast by a warehouse wall. He opens his satchel and takes out his morning meal, packed that morning in a square of linen, a round of barley bread, a handful of dried fish, a twist of paper holding roasted chickpeas still faintly warm. He eats slowly, watching the harbor traffic. A grain ship is being loaded 3 berths down. The stevedores passing sacks hand over hand in a chain that stretches from warehouse door to hold, their bodies swaying in the ancient rhythm of communal labor. Beyond them, at the harbor mouth, a warship is entering under oar power, its bronze ram catching the light as it clears the breakwater. And beyond that, visible even from here, the Pharos lighthouse stands against the pale sky, its mirror flashing in the late morning sun. Doros chews his bread and thinks about Nicandros. He has not seen his friend in nearly 2 weeks, unusual for them, though not unprecedented. The stacks have a way of swallowing Nicandros whole, especially during a heavy acquisition period, and the spring fleet has brought more material than usual this year. Doros mentions to a passing dock worker, a man he drinks with occasionally, a Cretan named Lycos, that he needs to drag Nicandros out for an evening soon before the man forgets what the sky looks like. He says it lightly, with a grin, but the thought lingers after the words. Nicandros has seemed quieter lately, more internal. The last time they shared a meal, Nicandros asked a question that Doros has been turning over without quite knowing why. Something about whether the documents he confiscates from Egyptian ships are usually medical texts and religious material, or whether there's ever anything that does not fit the expected categories. Doros had answered easily enough. Everything fits a category if the category is big enough. Nicandros had smiled at this, and the conversation had moved on, and Doros had thought nothing of it at the time. He thinks of it now, though, sitting on his rope coil, the chickpeas salty on his tongue, the harbor roaring around him. He thinks of his friend in the quiet stacks, surrounded by the accumulated words of the world, sorting and shelving and sorting again, and he feels, not worry exactly, something gentler, the awareness that the people we love are sometimes doing their hardest work in rooms we cannot enter. He finishes his meal, brushes the crumbs from his chiton, and stands. There are 6 more ships to board before the afternoon heat drives him off the quays. One of them, he happens to know, is an Egyptian vessel from Naucratis, and its cargo manifest mentions a collection of papyri from a temple library. Those scrolls, if they exist, if they are genuine, will be written in Demotic Egyptian, a script that Doros can recognize but cannot read. They will need to go to the one person in the library whose daily work bridges that particular gap between one language and another, one world and its translation. But that is for later. For now there are ships, and the sun is high, and the harbor, loud, fragrant, relentless, indifferent to the quiet questions of men who work in stacks, goes on with its ancient business of bringing the whole world to a single shore. The scriptorium is a long room on the eastern side of the Mausion complex, and in the mornings the light enters through high windows and falls in slanted columns across the rows of copyists at their work. There are perhaps 20 of them at this hour, Greek scribes seated at angled reading tables, each with a scroll pinned open before him and a fresh sheet of papyrus beside it, producing copies in the formal bookhand that the library requires for its permanent collection. The sound they make together is a dry, continuous whisper, reed tips touching papyrus, the faint scrape of a penknife trimming a nib, the soft click of an ink cake being moistened in its well. It is the sound of knowledge being duplicated, one careful line at a time, and it fills the room the way the sound of looms fills a weaver's workshop, constant, rhythmic, and strangely restful once you have grown accustomed to it. Tia's desk is at the far end of the room, near a window that faces the inner garden. She works alone, not because she has been excluded from the rows of copyists, but because her work is different from theirs. They are transcribers. Their task is to reproduce Greek texts in clean Greek copies, letter for letter, line for line, preserving without altering. Tia is a translator. The texts that arrive at her desk are written in Demotic Egyptian, the everyday written language of the Egyptian population, and her task is to render them into Greek so that they may be read, classified, and shelved within the library's collection. It is skilled work, rare work, and it places her in a particular position within the institution, essential and peripheral at once, like a hinge between two rooms that the people in each room would rather not think about. She is 26 years old. She has worked at the library for 4 years, an unusual appointment, secured through a combination of genuine talent and the quiet intervention of a Greek scholar who recognized in the demotic exercises she had submitted through her father's connections a fluency that the library badly needed. There are very few people in Alexandria who can read both Demotic and Greek with the facility required for this work. TA is one of them. She knows her value. She also knows that her stipend is lower than that of the Greek copyists at the far end of the room, and that her name does not appear in the same administrative registers as theirs. These are facts she has learned to walk with, noticeable but not disabling, and not worth stopping for every time they press. This morning a scroll has arrived from the harbor, one of the confiscated texts from the Egyptian vessel, sent up from the quays with a wax tablet note in Doros's blocky handwriting. Demotic, possibly medical, from Naucratis temple collection. Tia unties the cord that binds the roll, slips the wooden rod free, and begins to unroll it on her reading table, weighting the edges with smooth stones to hold it flat. The papyrus is not new. It has the particular feel of a working document, slightly rough at the edges, the ink faded in places where fingers have held it open many times. The script is demotic, written in the flowing cursive hand of a temple scribe, and the ink is the traditional Egyptian formula, carbon black, made from soot mixed with gum and diluted with water. Tia can see where the scribe's reed brush, the older Egyptian style, not the split nib calamo she herself uses, has left thicker deposits at the beginning of each line where the brush was freshly loaded. These are the small, involuntary signatures of a hand she will never meet, a scribe in a temple library somewhere in the Delta, copying a text that was perhaps already old when he set brush to papyrus. She reads the first lines. It is, as Doros guessed, a medical text, a treatment for persistent cough, specifically a cough that worsens in the season of Pare, the growing months when the fields are green and the air carries the fine dust of pollen and chaff. The treatment is detailed, a mixture of honey and thyme, warmed gently, administered 3 times daily with the patient's chest wrapped in linen dampened with an infusion of... And here Tia pauses, because the demotic word is one she knows from childhood but has never had to render into Greek. It is a plant name, specific and local, and she is not certain that a Greek equivalent exists. She makes a small mark on her wax tablet and continues. The treatment proceeds through dosages and methods of preparation, and then, without transition or apology, the text shifts into an invocation. It is addressed to Thoth, Jehuti in the Egyptian, as patron of healing knowledge, as the god who gave physicians the words that make remedies effective. The invocation is not a prayer appended to the medical instructions. It is woven into them. The rhythm of the demotic changes. The syntax becomes more formal, the word order more deliberate, and the incantation functions as the framework within which the physical treatment operates. Honey and thyme treat the body. The words treat the condition. They are not separate actions. They are the same action performed on 2 levels simultaneously. Tia sits back. She takes the calamos from behind her ear. She keeps it tucked there when she is reading, an old habit, and examines its split nib, not because it needs trimming, but because the gesture gives her hand something to do while her mind works. This is the problem. It arrives at her desk several times each month in different forms, and it never becomes easier. The library's classification system, the great Pinakes that organizes all human knowledge into categories, requires that a medical text be a medical text, that a religious text be a religious text, that an astronomical text be an astronomical text. The system is elegant, comprehensive, and entirely Greek in its assumptions about how knowledge is structured. It assumes that the world can be divided into subjects the way a city can be divided into quarters. And for Greek texts, this assumption works beautifully. Euripides goes with the dramatists, Herodotus goes with the historians, Euclid goes with the mathematicians. But this scroll was not written by a Greek mind, and it does not divide. In its original world, in the temple where it was composed and used, it was one thing, and that one thing had no name that Tia can translate, because the name would have been unnecessary. It was simply knowledge applied. The scribe who wrote it would not have understood the question, is this medicine or religion? Any more than he would have understood the question, is this breathing or living? Tia reaches for her second scribal palette, the one that holds her lead-based ink, the Greek formula, darker and slightly glossy on the papyrus compared to the matte black of the Egyptian carbon ink. She has 2 palettes, 2 inks, 2 reed pens trimmed to different widths. When she writes in demotic on her draft notes, she uses the carbon ink and the broader nib. When she writes the Greek translation, she switches to the lead ink and the finer split-reed calamos. She has done this so many times that the switching is unconscious, a motion of the hands, not a decision of the mind. But today, looking at the 2 palettes side by side on her desk, she is aware of what the switching means. She is the hinge. The text will pass through her, and something in the passage will change, and the change will be invisible to everyone who reads her translation, because they will not know what was there before. She begins to write. The ingredients and dosages come easily. Honey is honey in any language, and thyme grows on both sides of the Mediterranean. When she reaches the invocation, she makes her choice. She translates it in full, the meaning, the structure, the divine name rendered as Thoth in Greek, and she adds a marginal note, small and precise, in her careful hand. The following passage is integral to the treatment as composed. Separation from the medical instructions would alter the text's intended function. It is a quiet note. It will be read, if it is read at all, by whichever cataloguer shelves this scroll, and it will carry exactly as much weight as that cataloguer chooses to give it. She knows this. She writes it anyway. It is the compromise she can live with today. The morning passes. The copyists at the far end of the room work on in their dry, steady whisper. The light from the high windows shifts as the sun climbs, and the columns of light move slowly across the stone floor like the hands of a sundial. When the bell sounds for the midday meal, Tia cleans her pens, caps her ink wells, and walks to the communal refectory, the great domed hall where the Musyon scholars and staff eat together at a common table funded by the king's stipend. The room is full. The noon light enters from above, diffused through high openings in the dome, giving the space a warm, even glow. The table is laid with the usual fare, barley bread and wheat bread side by side, bowls of olives glistening with oil, white cheese crumbled on a plate, small dried fish arranged in rows, a dish of lentils flavored with cumin and coriander, and pitchers of wine mixed with water in the Greek fashion. The food is good. It is always good. The Ptolemies do not stint on the table that feeds the minds they have collected. Tia takes her bread and olives and a cup of the diluted wine and finds a seat at the table's edge. She is not excluded. No one has told her to sit apart, and if she chose a seat in the center of the table, no one would object. But the center is where the scholars congregate, the philologoi, the resident fellows of the Moussaillon, who eat and argue in continuous overlapping Greek, their conversations braiding together across the table like threads on a loom. She can follow these conversations. Her Greek is excellent, but following and belonging are different things, and Tia has learned the difference without bitterness, the way one learns the difference between a river and its bank, both necessary, both present, and the fact of their separateness not a judgment, but a geography. Across the table she can see Philo, a young Greek astronomer, perhaps her own age, recently arrived from Cyrene with a letter of introduction that gained him immediate admission to the Mousyon's scholarly circle. He is deep in conversation with 2 older colleagues, gesturing with a piece of bread, describing something about the visibility of certain stars in the summer sky. His enthusiasm is genuine, his confidence unexamined. The confidence of a person who has never had to wonder whether the room he is sitting in was built for someone like him. T.A. watches him for a moment over the rim of her cup. She does not resent him. She recognizes with a clarity that has nothing to do with anger that his ease and her carefulness are products of the same system, and that the system is not thinking about either of them. It is thinking about scrolls. She finishes her bread, her olives, her wine. The lentils are good today. Someone in the kitchen has been generous with the cumin. She returns her cup to the table and walks back through the colonnaded peripatos toward the scriptorium. The afternoon's work is waiting. There are more scrolls to translate, more choices to make in the space between two inks, and the light will be good for several more hours yet. The heat is building, but the scriptorium's stone walls hold the morning's coolness a little longer than the open courtyards, and if she works steadily, she can finish the medical papyrus before the day turns heavy and the air begins to press. The afternoon stretches ahead of her, long, bright, and full of the particular silence of a person doing difficult work that no one else in the room can see. The afternoon does turn heavy, as afternoons in Alexandria always do. The sun climbs past its zenith and begins that long, weighted descent toward the western harbor, and the air thickens, and the stone of the Museon's walls finally surrenders the last of its morning coolness and begins to radiate heat back into the scriptorium like a slow exhalation. T.A. finishes the medical papyrus, the cough remedy with its incantation to Thoth, the honey and thyme preparation rendered into clean Greek prose, the divine formula compressed into a marginal note that preserves its sounds but not its breath. She cleans her calamos, wipes the split tip carefully with a scrap of linen, and sets it beside the ink cakes on her scribal palette. She caps the small water pot. She rolls the finished translation and ties it with a strip of flax, then places it in the outgoing bin where it will wait for Nicandros or one of the other catalogers to collect it in the morning. The scriptorium is emptying. The Greek copyists have been leaving in ones and twos for the past hour, their formal book hands growing less precise as the heat pressed in. And now the long room holds only Tae and one elderly scribe at the far end who seems to have fallen asleep over an unfinished page of Pindar. She gathers her things, a small leather satchel that holds a comb, a few coins, a folded square of linen for wiping ink from her fingers, and steps out through the scriptorium's side entrance into the peripatos. The colonnaded walkway is quieter now than it was this morning. A few scholars still pace its length in the peripatetic fashion, walking and talking, their sandals scuffing softly on the stone, their voices carrying in that particular way that columns and open air produce, clear at a distance, muddled up close, as though the architecture itself were selecting which conversations to preserve. T.A. passes between them without stopping. She crosses the small garden courtyard where a fig tree, old and broad, casts a circle of shade that 3 junior scholars have claimed for a napping spot, their hymations pulled over their faces against the light. The garden smells of heated earth and something green, crushed mint, perhaps, from the kitchen garden that abuts the refectory wall. Beyond the courtyard, she reaches the gate in the precinct wall where the Bruchaion ends and the city proper begins, and she steps through it into the late afternoon. Let us walk with her. The transition is not abrupt. The royal quarter does not end in a hard line, but rather loosens. The buildings grow slightly less formal. The colonnades give way to simpler porticos. The marble paving yields to fitted limestone and then, gradually, to packed earth, but the change in sound is immediate. Inside the Mausion, the dominant noise is human speech, Greek speech, measured and deliberate, the rhythms of reading aloud and scholarly argument. Outside, the city roars. Cartwheels grind over stone, donkeys bray. A water seller calls out his price in Koine Greek, 2 obols for a jar, cold from the cistern. Somewhere nearby, a coppersmith is hammering, the bright metallic ring cutting through the lower hum of commerce and foot traffic. T.A. walks south along one of the broad colonnaded avenues, the street wide enough for 2 chariots to pass abreast, the afternoon light falling in long diagonal bars between the columns. The stone stoi on either side shelter shops at street level, a sandal maker, a seller of oil lamps, a man with a table of carved amulets laid out on linen, wedjat eyes and scarab beetles and tiny bez figures in faience, each one promising protection for a few drachmas. She does not stop at the amulet seller's table, but she sees the objects as she passes, the way one sees familiar things without deciding to look. The same small gods that stand on the altar in her father's house, mass-produced here for a city that buys them by the thousands, each one touched by someone's hope before it is touched by a buyer's hand. The avenue carries her south for perhaps 10 minutes before she turns off the main grid into a narrower street, and here the world shifts. The columns disappear. The buildings press closer, their upper stories leaning toward each other across the lane, creating a tunnel of shade that is welcome in the heat. The language changes. On the colonnaded avenue, the voices around her were Greek, merchants, officials, soldiers from the Ptolemaic garrison speaking Koine with a dozen regional accents. Here, in the streets that feed into Rakotis, the voices are demotic Egyptian. The rhythms are different, the vowels rounder, the consonants softer, and T.A.'s own body changes in response, a loosening she is not conscious of, a settling into a language that does not require the small constant effort of her working day. She does not code switch deliberately. She simply arrives in the part of herself that thinks in her mother's tongue, the way one arrives home before reaching one's door. The smells change, too. The Brucayon smelled of the sea, salt and harbor pitch and the dry mineral scent of dressed stone. Here the air is thicker, layered. Bread baking in a clay oven, the yeasty, slightly scorched warmth of barley loaves pulled from the coals. Fish drying on wooden racks outside a shop, the sharp marine edge of salt and brine. The ammoniac bite of a tannery somewhere to the east, present as a permanent background note that the neighborhood has long since stopped noticing. And beneath it all, the green, slightly brackish smell of the canal that runs from Lake Mareotis through the southern edge of the district, carrying grain barges and fishing boats, and, in the heat of summer, a faintly organic odor of warm water and reed. She passes the canal now. Flat-bottomed boats are moored along the stone embankment, their cargoes of grain sacks already unloaded, their boatmen sitting in the shade of canvas awnings, eating their evening meal. One of them has a small brazier going and is grilling something, onions from the smell, and perhaps a piece of flatbread. The light on the canal water is bronze in the late afternoon, broken into shifting planes by the slow passage of a barge heading south toward the lake. And here is her stall. It is not a shop, but a woman with a wide clay griddle set over a charcoal fire, positioned at the corner where the canal path meets a cross street. The griddle is black with years of use, and on it small rounds of chickpea batter are frying in oil. each one sizzling at the edges, turning golden, releasing a smell that is, let us be honest, the best smell in Alexandria. The woman shapes each cake with a practiced flip of her wooden spatula, and the cumin she has mixed into the batter rises with the steam, warm and earthy and slightly sharp. She wraps each finished cake in a fig leaf, which gives the outside a faint green bitterness that cuts the richness of the oil. Tia buys too. She pays with a small bronze coin and does not wait for the half-obol change that might be owed. The woman nods. They do not speak. This is a transaction that happens every working day and has long since moved past the need for words. Tia eats standing by the canal, watching the water. The oil is warm on her fingers. The cumin lingers on her tongue. A heron stands in the shallows on the far bank, motionless, its reflection doubled in the still water near the reeds. This exact moment, this taste, this light, this bird is hers. It belongs to no archive. It fits no classification. She finishes the second cake, wipes her fingers on the fig leaf, and drops the leaf into the canal where it turns slowly in the current and drifts south. She walks the last few streets to her father's house. The door is open. Doors in Rakoti stand open in the warm months, letting air move through the narrow rooms. She steps inside, through the small prothyron with its single worn step, into the central courtyard where the evening light falls in a warm rectangle on the packed earth floor. Her father Ka is at work. His workshop opens off the courtyard, a room perhaps 8 feet square, its walls hung with finished and half-finished panels, its single window facing west to catch the last good light of the day. He paints funerary goods, the wooden coffin panels that will frame the faces of the dead, the bright scenes on canopic jars, the small ushabti figures, servant statuettes, each one a few inches tall, meant to labor in the afterlife on the dead person's behalf. His pigments sit in small clay dishes on a low table, red ochre for flesh and borders, yellow orpiment for sunlight and grain fields, the vivid blue of Egyptian frit for sky and water and the wings of certain gods. The binding medium, egg and acacia gum, gives the room a faint particular smell, organic and slightly sweet, layered over the dry cedar scent of the wood panels themselves. Ka looks up when Tia enters, and his face does what it always does, the small, involuntary brightening of a parent whose child has come home safely from a world he cannot follow her into. He asks about her day. She tells him something small and true, that she translated a medical text today that reminded her of old Aunt Nibataya's remedy for cough, honey, and thyme, and that the papyrus included an invocation to Thoth that she had to compress into a footnote. Ka nods. He understands the honey and thyme. The invocation to Thoth he understands better than his daughter might guess. Thoth is the patron of scribes, and Ka has painted his ibis-headed figure on dozens of coffin panels, each time with the same careful attention to the curve of the beak, the same prayer murmured as he mixes the black ink for the god's feathers. But the idea that his daughter's work involves deciding how much of Thoth to keep and how much to set aside, this he cannot quite reach, and he does not press. He is proud of her in a way that lives in his face more than in his words, a pride made tender by the gentle distance between a father's world and the world he worked to make possible for his child. Tia moves through the courtyard toward the back room where she sleeps. She passes the household altar in its niche in the courtyard wall, Bess and Taweret in terracotta, barely 4 inches tall, and between them a small faience bastet, the cat goddess. Before all three, a clay dish holds the remnants of this morning's offering, a piece of bread gone stale in the heat, a few dried petals of blue lotus. Above the altar, on a cord of braided flax, hangs a Wedjat eye amulet, the restored eye of Horus, its glazed surface catching the last of the courtyard light. Ta passes the altar the way one passes any familiar thing, without stopping, without consciously seeing it, the way her hand finds the doorframe in the dark. These gods have been in this niche since before she was born. They watched her father carry her home as an infant. They watched her learn to walk in this courtyard. They are watching now. She does not think about them. They do not require her to think about them. That is not how household gods work. They work by being there, silent, paint-chipped, bread-fed, permanent, while the people around them do the difficult, daily business of living. The evening stretches ahead. Through the open door, the sounds of rakotis settle into their nighttime register. Lower, softer, the daytime commerce replaced by cooking sounds, children's voices, the distant call of a priest at the temple of Isis beginning the evening rites. Somewhere a woman is singing, a lullaby perhaps, or a work song, the melody old and unhurried, carrying over the rooftops in the warm air. Ta sits on the edge of her sleeping mat and flexes her writing hand. The fingers are stiff. The tendons between the knuckles ache with a low, persistent soreness that she has been ignoring for weeks, pressing through it the way one presses through any discomfort that comes with necessary work. She opens and closes the hand several times, watching the fingers respond, and makes a note to herself, not on papyrus, not in any archive, just a quiet interior notation that she will ask her father if he knows someone in the neighborhood who treats this kind of thing. The spring evenings are long and warm. The light lingers on the canal, on the rooftops, on the pale walls of rakotis, and does not fade so much as deepen. Gold becoming amber, becoming the soft violet gray of an Alexandrian dusk. In other parts of the city, the day is ending differently. In the harbor district, the last ships are being secured for the night, their rigging lines singing in the evening breeze off the Mediterranean. In the taverns along the canal, the evening crowd is gathering, dock workers and off-duty soldiers and minor merchants, settling onto stone benches calling for beer. And in one of these taverns, a man who works the harbor is looking for his oldest friend, the man in the stacks, because he has not seen him in weeks, and it is time, as it periodically is, to drag him back into the living world. The tavern has no name that anyone remembers. It sits where two streets meet near the canal that connects the harbor to Lake Mareotis, not in the Greek quarter and not in Rakotis, but in the broad commercial district between them, where the city's ethnic boundaries blur into something more practical and less observed. The building is old, low-ceilinged, built of mud brick with a stone floor worn smooth by decades of sandals and spilled beer. The doorway opens directly onto the street, and on warm evenings like this one, the distinction between inside and outside barely exists. The sounds of the canal traffic, the creak of grain barges being poled along the waterway, the occasional bray of a donkey, all of it drifts through the open doorway and mixes with the voices inside. Doros arrives first. He always arrives first. He greets the woman behind the counter, a broad-shouldered Egyptian woman who has been running this place since before he started working the harbor, and orders 2 cups of beer. The beer here is the thick barley kind, opaque and faintly sweet, closer to a thin porridge than anything a Greek would call a drink. But Doros has lived in this city long enough to have lost whatever preferences he arrived with. He carries the 2 clay cups to a bench against the far wall, sets them down, and waits. The tavern is half full. A table of dock workers is sharing a plate of fried fish, small silver fish from the harbor, battered and cooked in sesame oil, their bones thin enough to eat whole. 2 off-duty soldiers from the palace garrison sit near the door, speaking quietly in Macedonian, their cloaks folded beside them. A merchant, Persian, by his dress, eats bread and lentil stew alone, a ledger tablet open beside his bowl. This is the kind of place the city produces naturally, a room where the grid plan's careful separations dissolve into the simple democracy of hunger and thirst and the end of a working day. Nikandros arrives late. He ducks through the doorway with the slightly dazed expression of a man who has just walked from a well-lit room into a dim one, blinking as his eyes adjust. He is still carrying a wax tablet under his arm. He often forgets to put things down when he leaves the library, and Doros reaches over and takes it from him before he sits, setting it on the bench beside them with the practiced ease of someone who has been confiscating objects from his friend for 20 years. They eat bread and dried fish, a dish of chickpeas in olive oil, a few radishes. The food is plain and good. Doros eats with the appetite of a man who has spent the day climbing ship ladders and hauling scroll cases. Nikandros eats the way he does everything, steadily and with a certain inward focus, as though the bread requires the same careful attention he gives to a damaged catalogue entry. Doros talks. He is a natural storyteller, not in the literary sense, not the kind of man who shapes his anecdotes for effect, but in the older, simpler sense. Things happen to him, and he tells people about them, and the telling is vivid because his attention to the physical world is vivid. Tonight he has a good one. A captain from Rhodes arrived this morning with a cargo of Cretan wine and, tucked between the amphorae, a bundle of scrolls wrapped in oilcloth that the captain swore on his mother's grave were personal letters to his wife. Doros unwrapped them on the quay, as he always does, because they are always not letters to the captain's wife, and found a clean copy of 3 plays by Menander, or rather, found a document claiming to be 3 plays by Menander. The papyrus was aged with smoke. Doros could smell it, the faint, acrid residue that real age does not leave, and the script, while competent, used letter forms that belonged to the previous century's fashion rather than to any genuinely old hand, a forgery, and not even a particularly good one. He tells the story well, the captain's outrage, performed and transparent, the crew watching from the rail, amused, Doros's own calm as he pointed out the anachronisms, not unkindly, because there is no profit in humiliating a man you will see again next sailing season, and the captain's eventual grudging surrender of the fakes alongside the 2 genuine scrolls buried deeper in the cargo, a treatise on navigation and a short agricultural text that might actually be worth something. The whole exchange took perhaps 20 minutes and accomplished in miniature the same thing the library accomplishes at scale. The separation of the authentic from the invented, the real from the merely plausible. Nicandros laughs at the right moments. He asks a question about the navigation treatise, what language, what condition, and Doros answers with the specificity of a man who handles these objects daily without reading them deeply. Rolled tight, good condition, Greek, smelled like cedar. Someone had stored it in a proper chest. Nicandros nods. He will probably see this scroll on his classification table within the week. The beer is good. The evening air carries the smell of the canal, water and mud, and the faint green scent of papyrus plants growing wild along the banks. And through the doorway, the last light is fading over the masts in the harbor. Doros refills their cups from a larger vessel the tavern woman has left at their table, and for a few minutes they simply sit, two men in their middle years, comfortable in each other's silence the way only very old friends can be. It is Nicandros who breaks the quiet, and when he does, the question comes out sideways, the way important questions often do. He asks Doros about the Egyptian ships, the ones that come upriver from the south, from the old temple towns along the Nile. The documents he confiscates from those vessels, are they usually what you would expect? Medical texts, religious scrolls, temple records? Or does he ever find things that do not fit neatly into one description? Doros looks at him. The question is odd, not because it is strange in itself, but because Nicandros has never shown much interest in the intake side of the library's operation. His world is the classification table, the Pinakes, the moment after a scroll has been received and copied and needs to be placed somewhere in the system. The harbor is Doros's domain, and the two men have maintained this easy division of territory for years. Doros considers it honestly. He tells Nicandros that most of what he sees from the Egyptian ships is exactly what you would expect: temple inventories, land records, medical compilations, priestly calendars. But yes, sometimes there are texts that resist easy description, that seem to be several things folded together. He mentions casually a scroll he handled last month that appeared to be an agricultural calendar, but was also, according to the tag written by the priest who sent it, a guide to the movements of certain stars. He did not read it closely. He cannot read demotic with any fluency. But he remembers the tag because it listed two subjects where his intake form only had space for one, and he had to make a choice about which word to write down. Nicandros is quiet for a moment. Then he says something about the Pinakes, how the whole system works by assuming that a text is primarily one thing: a medical text, an astronomical text, a work of poetry, a religious hymn. The system has cross-references, he acknowledges, but the cross-references are secondary. They point to the primary classification, and the primary classification is always singular. One scroll, one category, one place on the shelf. Doros watches his friend. He does not entirely follow the concern, but he recognizes its weight. He has known Nicandros since they were both young copyists in the scriptorium, sitting side by side transcribing Herodotus by lamplight, their fingers stained with the same carbon ink. He knows the particular tone Nicandros uses when something is working at him, quiet, almost casual, as though the question were merely interesting rather than urgent. He offers what he can. Everything fits a category if you make the category big enough. He says it lightly, meaning it as comfort, as a practical man's answer to a theoretical worry. The world is full of things that resist sorting, and the world goes on. Nicandros smiles. It is a real smile, grateful and a little rueful. the smile of a man who has just been reminded that his friend's greatest gift is also the reason this particular conversation cannot go further. Doros lives in the world of objects, the weight of a scroll in the hand, the smell of smoke on a forgery, the specific creak of a ship's cargo hold. The question Nicandros is carrying lies in the space between objects, in the system that organizes them, in the assumptions that make the system possible. It is not a question Doros can help him carry, but the attempt, the reaching across, matters, and both men feel it without saying so. The conversation moves on. Doros tells another story, this one about a Phoenician sailor who tried to barter a jar of pickled octopus for the return of a confiscated scroll, and the negotiation that followed, conducted in broken Koine with hand gestures on both sides. Nicandros laughs, and this time the laugh is easier, fuller. The evening settles around them. The tavern fills and empties. The canal boats pass in the dark, their lanterns reflected in the water. When they leave, walking together through the warm streets toward the point where their paths diverge, Doros toward his rooms near the harbor, Nicandros back toward the Bruchayon and the Mausayon's quarters, Doros claps his friend on the shoulder and tells him to come out again soon, not to disappear into the stacks for another month. Nicandros promises. They part at the corner where the broad colonnaded avenue begins, and Nicandros walks north alone, the wax tablet back under his arm, the sounds of the tavern district fading behind him into the hum and pulse of the city at night. The canal water glints in the dark as Doros turns the last corner toward his lodgings. Behind him, the tavern noise softens to a murmur and then to silence. The spring is ending. The days grow longer, hotter, and the sailing season is in full surge. The library's great machine of acquisition turning week after week, and the people inside it turning with it, each carrying their particular questions, the long Alexandrian summer gathering ahead of them like heat on stone. The summer comes to Alexandria not gradually but in layers, each one heavier than the last. First the sea breeze falters, losing the cool edge it carried through spring. Then the stones of the colonnaded avenues begin to hold their warmth past sundown, so that the streets at midnight still radiate the memory of noon. Then the air itself thickens, a heaviness carried inland from the harbor, salt and moisture pressing against the skin, settling into the lungs, turning every enclosed space into something closer to a bath than a room. In the scriptorium of the Mausion, where the copyists work in long rows at their slanted tables, the summer announces itself in the particular way ink behaves. It dries faster on the papyrus, which is good for speed but treacherous for precision, because a reed pen that moves too slowly leaves a thick blotted stroke, and a pen that moves too quickly skips across the grain. The scribes adjust. They thin their ink a little more, dip a little more often, and work in the early hours when the air is marginally cooler, their reed pens scratching in the blue half-light before the lamps are truly needed. T.A. adjusts, too. She has learned, across 2 years of this work, to arrive before anyone else, to claim the table nearest the narrow window that admits a thread of sea air from the direction of the harbor. She lays out her tools in the same order every morning, the 2 scribal palettes, each with its dried ink cake waiting to be moistened, the Calamos pens trimmed the previous evening, the penknife and pumice stone, the small clay water pot. The ritual of arrangement steadies her. It is the door through which she enters the work, and the work, once entered, has its own sustaining rhythm. Today she is finishing a translation she began 3 days ago, a short agricultural text from the Fayoum, a set of instructions for canal maintenance keyed to the flooding cycle of the Nile. It is straightforward. The demotic is functional, not literary. The Greek equivalents come easily. Her pen moves in the careful, even strokes of the formal book hand, each letter formed with the particular discipline the library requires of its finished copies. But her hand is not right. It has not been right for several weeks. The trouble lives in the narrow valley between her thumb and forefinger, in the web of small muscles that clamp the reed pen against her palm for hours at a stretch. The pain began as a dull stiffness at the end of long working days, the kind of ache she shook out by flexing her fingers, rolling her wrist, pressing her thumb into the meat of her palm. She thought nothing of it. Every scribe she knows carries some version of this complaint. The older copyists in the main scriptorium have hands that curl slightly even at rest, their fingers shaped by decades of gripping into a permanent echo of the pen. She has seen them working with wrappings of linen around their knuckles, or pausing to soak their hands in bowls of warm water kept beneath their tables. It is the body's tax on the work, and she has always assumed she would pay it eventually, the way one assumes a roof will need mending someday. Not yet, not urgently, but in the natural course of things. Now it is urgent. The stiffness has sharpened into something that wakes her in the morning before she opens her eyes. A tight, hot wire running from her wrist into the base of her thumb, pulling the hand into a half fist that she must consciously unclench before she can grip anything. She has begun shaking her hand between lines, a quick private gesture she tries to keep invisible to the other scribes. She has begun switching the pen to her left hand for rough notes, though her left-hand script is ungainly and slow. And she has noticed, this is what frightens her, though she would not use that word, that the formal book hand, the precise, even lettering that is the visible measure of her skill and her value to the library, has begun to waver. Not badly, not in a way that anyone checking her work has yet remarked upon, but she can see it. The downstrokes of her epsilon are fractionally uneven. The horizontal bars of her ETA carry a tremor that was not there in the spring. She is 24 years old, and her hand is failing, and the hand is everything. Her father notices before she mentions it. He is a man who works with his own hands all day, painting funerary panels and ushabti figures in his workshop in Rakotis. His fingers permanently stained with red ochre and the blue of Egyptian frit, and he recognizes the particular way his daughter holds her right hand in the evening, cradled in her left as though carrying something fragile. He does not ask directly. He is not a man who presses. Instead, over their evening meal, bread, a stew of lentils and onions flavored with cumin, a shared cup of barley beer, he mentions, as though the thought has only just occurred to him, that there is a woman 3 streets away, Merit, who is known for treating ailments of the hands and joints. She treated Ka's own shoulder 2 winters ago, when the cold made the joint stiff and grinding. He says this lightly, almost as an afterthought, and Tia nods and does not answer, and the next morning she goes to work as usual. 4 days later, when the tremor in her etta has not improved and the hot wire in her thumb wakes her again before dawn, she goes to Merit's door. The workshop is as it has always been, though Tia has never seen it before. the ground floor room opening onto the small courtyard, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, the rows of clay jars on their shelves, each sealed with a cloth stopper and marked with a demotic notation in faded ink. The room smells of green things drying, of warm stone, and beneath these, something sharper and more medicinal, perhaps the castor oil that Tia will later learn Merit uses as a base for many of her preparations. In the corner, the familiar altar holds its figures, Bess and Taweret in their settled poses, small offerings before them, a heel of bread and a few dried flowers, a splash of beer darkening the clay dish. The altar has the undemonstrative quality of a thing tended daily for years. It is not a display, it is furniture. It is as natural in this room as the workbench and the mortar. Merit receives Taye with the practical warmth of a woman who has done this 10,000 times. She does not ask why Taye has come. She asks which hand and when it started, and whether the pain is worse in the morning or the evening. She sits Taye on a low stool and takes the right hand in both of her own. Her examination is thorough and unhurried. She presses along each tendon with her thumb, testing for heat and swelling. She bends each finger individually, watching Tia's face for the involuntary flinch that reveals the pain's true location. She asks Tia to grip her own forearm and squeeze, and notes the weakness. She asks about working posture, how Tia holds the pen, how far her wrist bends, how many hours without rest. The questions are specific and informed and carry the quiet authority of someone who has treated scribes' hands before, who knows exactly where this kind of damage accumulates and why. Merit prepares a compress. She takes a square of linen, lays it flat, and spreads across it a warm paste. Tia can smell the thyme in it, and something earthier beneath, perhaps fenugreek, and the base note of warmed castor oil. Merit wraps the compress around Ty's hand and wrist, pressing it gently into place, and then she begins to work. With her thumbs, she presses into the cramped muscles of the palm, moving slowly along the inflamed tendons, finding the knots of tension and holding pressure against them until they soften. The pressure is firm, not gentle, and Taye's breath catches once, sharply, before she settles into it. And here is what Merit notices, though she says nothing. T does not look away. Most patients turn their gaze elsewhere during treatment, to the wall, to the altar, to some middle distance where they can separate themselves from the discomfort. T.A. watches. Her eyes follow Merit's hands on her own hand with a focused, attentive quality that is neither anxious nor detached. She is observing the technique. She is watching the angle of Merit's thumb, the direction of the pressure, the way Merit's fingers find the edge of a tendon and follow it. It is the gaze of someone who learns by seeing, who cannot help but learn by seeing, even when she is the one being treated. Merit's hands do not change what they are doing, but some small awareness enters her movements, the consciousness of being watched by someone who is truly paying attention, the way a singer's breath changes, almost imperceptibly when they sense the room has gone quiet. The treatment takes perhaps 20 minutes. Merit unwraps the compress, tests the hand's mobility again, and nods, satisfied though not finished. She gives T a small clay pot of ointment, sealed with a linen cap, and instructions. Warm a pinch between the palms before sleeping. Work it into the base of the thumb and along the tendons of the wrist, and come back in 4 days. The fee is modest, a few copper coins, and Taye pays it from the small leather purse she carries in her satchel, the purse that holds her library wages. They exchange no personal information. Tia does not say where she works or what she writes. Merit does not ask. Two women in a room, one treating, one treated. The transaction clean and professional, and beneath its surface carrying the faintest charge of mutual recognition. Two people who know what it means to work with their hands, who understand in their bodies the cost of precision, who have built their lives around the particular intelligence that lives in the fingers. Tia walks home through the late afternoon heat. She stops at a food stall near the canal for a piece of warm flatbread folded around soft cheese, eating it standing up, her treated hand still tingling from the compress, the light lying long and golden across the surface of Lake Mareotis. A cargo boat passes, low in the water. The boatman calls something to another vessel in Demotic, a phrase Taye catches but does not quite process. Her mind is still partly in Merit's workshop, still feeling the pressure of those thumbs along her tendons, still seeing the angle of the work. The summer deepens. At the library, the flow of acquisitions continues. Ships from the Red Sea ports, agents returning from Athens and Pergamon, confiscated documents arriving at the scriptorium in batches that must be copied, translated, classified. And among the new scrolls arriving at Nicandros's desk, carried by a runner from the harbor with Doros's handwriting on the tag, are texts that will require Taye's specific skills, texts that carry within them a problem neither the Pinakes nor any catalogue was designed to solve. Among the summer's acquisitions, one scroll gives Nicandros pause before he even opens it. It arrives in a cedarwood case from Upper Egypt, not from the harbor confiscations, but from Apollodoros, a book agent who travels the old temple cities of Thebes, Edfu, and Dendera. Apollodoros's note on a wax tablet tucked inside the case identifies 11 scrolls by brief description and subject. Beside the 7th, he has written simply Egyptian, temple provenance, mixed content, uncertain classification. Nicandros sets the other 11 aside. They are manageable, the usual, and turns to the 7th. It is a long roll, perhaps 30 feet when fully extended, wound tightly on wooden rods, whose ends are carved with small lotus bud finials, the mark of a priestly scriptorium. He unrolls the first section and immediately sees what the agent meant by mixed content. The text is Demotic Egyptian, dense, precise, written in a formal hand that speaks of training and care, and it is illustrated with small diagrams. He can make out numerical notations and what appear to be star names. But the text itself is beyond his functional Egyptian. He re-rolls the scroll carefully, writes a request on an ostrakon for a demotic translator capable of handling technical material, and sends it with a runner. The scroll waits. It reaches Tia's desk 2 days later. She clears her work surface, sets out her tools, the 2 scribal palettes, one loaded with carbon black ink and the other with the lead-based Greek formula, her Callimachus pen freshly trimmed with the scalprum, her pumice stone, a cup of water for diluting the ink cakes, and a stack of clean papyrus sheets for the translation. She unrolls the first section and begins to read. The text opens with a calendar. It is keyed to the rising of specific deacon stars, the 36 star groups that the Egyptian astronomers had tracked for millennia, each one governing a 10-day period of the year. The calendar is precise, systematic and annotated with observational notes indicating the angle of each star's rising above the horizon at a specific location. A temple, Tia guesses, though the text does not name it. She recognizes the astronomical framework from other texts she has translated. It is good work, careful, old, but the calendar does not stand alone. Attached to each decan period, woven into the text as naturally as branches from a trunk, is a set of medical prescriptions. For the 10 days governed by the star Sopdet, there are treatments for the fevers that arrive with the inundation season. For the decan period of Kentet Heret, when the dry winds blow from the desert, there are preparations for throat ailments and cracked skin. The prescriptions are practical and specific, quantities given in exact measures, preparation methods described step by step, the herbs named in demotic with a precision that suggests the author grew them or gathered them personally. Honey and thyme appear, castor oil, a plant whose demotic name Tai does not immediately recognize. She sounds it out under her breath, and the word is unfamiliar, something she has not encountered in the library's existing medical papyri. She marks it with a small notation in red ink and continues. And then, surrounding and interpenetrating both the astronomical calendar and the medical prescriptions, there are the invocations, prayers to Thoth, Jehuti in the Demotic, as patron of knowledge, as measurer of time, as the ibis-headed god who invented writing itself. But these are not separate hymns appended to the end of the text, the way a Greek editor might add a dedicatory poem to a philosophical treatise. They are the structural framework. The astronomical observations are presented as acts of devotion to Thoth. The medical prescriptions are framed as applications of Thoth's wisdom to the body. The text does not treat these as three subjects, astronomy, medicine, religion, that happen to share a scroll. It treats them as one subject viewed from three angles simultaneously, unified by the understanding that the stars and the body and the divine are expressions of the same underlying order. Tia sits with this for a long time. She reads the scroll through to its end, more than an hour of careful work, her Callimachus pen still, her hands motionless except to unroll the papyrus from the left-hand rod to the right. When she finishes, she re-rolls it properly, sits back, and looks at the ceiling of the scriptorium. The cedar beams are darkened with lamp smoke. Somewhere behind her, a Greek copyist is working through a batch of Pindar, murmuring the lines aloud as he writes, the rhythm of the poetry audible even without the words. She closes her eyes briefly, feeling the stiffness in her writing hand, the one Merritt has been treating, and thinks about how to begin. She translates it over the course of 4 days. She works in Greek, producing a clean version in the formal book hand the library requires, using the lead-based ink that marks the text as a Greek-language document. For the plant names and divine epithets that have no Greek equivalent, she transliterates, preserving the demotic sounds in Greek characters, with marginal notes explaining each term. For the invocations to Thoth, she makes a choice that costs her. She translates them fully, preserving their position within the text, marking them not as appendices or annotations, but as integral elements of the document structure. She knows this will make the scroll harder to classify. She knows this is the accurate translation. When she brings the completed work to Nicandros, it is late afternoon. The light in the storage room is golden and angled, falling through the high windows and catching the dust motes that rise from disturbed papyrus. She finds him at his work table, surrounded by the other scrolls from the same shipment, already classified and tagged for shelving. He looks up as she approaches, and something in his face shifts very slightly. A kind of alertness, the expression of a man who has been expecting a difficult delivery. She sets the translation beside the original and explains the text's structure. She is precise, professional, and matter-of-fact. She describes the astronomical calendar, the medical prescriptions, the invocations, and the way they interpenetrate. She uses the word unified once, quietly, and does not repeat it. Nicandros reads the translation. He reads it slowly, the way he reads everything, his lips moving slightly, his forefinger tracing the line, his body still. When he reaches the first invocation to Thoth, embedded between a star observation and a prescription for fever, he pauses. He unrolls the original demotic scroll beside the translation and looks at them both, side by side on his table, and for a moment the two documents seem to be regarding each other across an unbridgeable distance, one in the language of its making, the other in the language of the institution that has consumed it. He tries the obvious classifications, astronomy, but the medical content is not incidental. It is half the text. Medicine, but the astronomical framework is not decorative. It is the organizing principle. Religion, but the invocations serve a structural function, not a devotional one in isolation. He opens his wax tablet and writes a cross-reference notation, the kind the Pinakes allows but rarely uses. See also entries that would link this scroll to 3 different subject headings simultaneously. Even this feels like an approximation. The text was not written to be found by someone searching for astronomy or medicine or prayers to Thoth. It was written to be used by someone who already understood that these were not separate things. He looks up at Taye. She is still standing by his table, waiting, not anxiously, but with the steady patience of someone who has already done her part and is watching to see what the system does with it. He asks her, in a tone that is professional but carries a thread of genuine curiosity, whether this kind of text is common in the temple collections. She considers the question. She tells him that from what she has seen, most of the Egyptian texts that arrive at the library are like this to some degree. The boundaries between what the Pinakes calls separate subjects are not boundaries that the original authors recognized. She says this without judgment, as a piece of information, the way she might report a variant spelling or a damaged line. Nicandros nods. He writes his classification, astronomy, primary, with cross-reference notes to medicine and to religious texts, and affixes the tag to the scroll bin. The decision is reasonable. It is defensible. He has done his job well, as he always does. Taye returns to her desk. Nicandros sits for a moment longer in the storage room, the late light now fading, the dust settling back onto the shelves. Around him, in their wooden pigeonholes, the scrolls of the world's largest collection wait in their assigned places, sorted, labeled, findable. And somewhere among them, tagged and shelved and cross-referenced with meticulous care, a text that was once one thing has become, by the careful and necessary work of 2 people who understand exactly what they have done. 3. The summer wears on. The heat in the scriptorium builds and holds. The afternoons heavy and still. The oil lamps unnecessary until the sun drops behind the palace walls. Taye's writing hand aches in the evenings. The sustained work on the temple scroll has set back her recovery by days. She returns to Merritt's door for her second treatment, carrying the small clay pot of ointment nearly empty in her satchel, and this time, when Merritt opens the door and sees her standing in the late afternoon light, she stays a little longer. Tia returns to Merritt's workshop 4 days later in the long golden light of late afternoon. The room is as she remembers it. The herbs on the beams, the clay jars in their rows, the familiar altar in its corner. But the quality of the light has changed. The sun lower now, throwing warm rectangles across the workbench and the packed earth floor. Summer light, the kind that makes a room feel like something held gently in a cupped hand. Merritt takes the hand without preamble. Her examination is briefer this time. She already knows the landscape. The surface inflammation has eased. The fingers move more freely, but the deeper tension remains. The shortened tendons, the cramped muscles of thumb and forefinger. The hand will continue to improve if Taya rests it, and Merritt does not ask whether she intends to, because she has treated enough scribes and weavers to know the answer. She prepares a fresh compress, thyme and castor oil, and something faintly resinous that Tia cannot name, and begins to work the muscles through the warmth, pressing with her thumbs in slow, firm circles along the tendons. And Tia watches as she did before, but differently now. Not with a patient's general attention, but with recognition, watching Merritt's hands the way one reads a text in a language one shares. The angle of the thumb, the responsive rhythm of pressure that adjusts to what the muscles are doing underneath. Knowledge encoded in the hands rather than in ink, transmitted through supervised repetition and the slow calibration of touch against living tissue over years. Merritt feels it, that quality of being watched by someone who truly sees. Her own awareness shifts, a fraction more presence entering her movements, the way any practiced hand responds when it knows it is understood. As Merritt works the ointment into the tendons, Tia's gaze lifts and moves around the room. The clay jars with their scratched marks, a private notation system that means nothing to anyone but Merritt. The mortar worn asymmetrical by her dominant hand. The bundles of herbs hanging from the ceiling, each tied with a different knot or color of thread. One bundle hangs near the window, its leaves a dusty silver green that Taya has never seen before. She asks about it, in Demotic, because names live most truly in the language that first spoke them. Merritt gives the name, 2 syllables specific descriptive of the plant's growing habit. Tia has never encountered this word in any of the medical papyri she has translated at the library, not in the treatment for cough, not in the temple scroll with its astronomical calendar, not in any text that has passed through her hands in more than 3 years of daily work. She files it away, and the filing carries a weight she does not examine, because if this word is not in the library's collection, then how many others are there? How many names and preparations exist in rooms like this one, in the hands of women like Merritt, in a living practice that no book agent will ever confiscate from a ship because it was never written on a ship in the first place? It was written in hands, in the angle of a thumb pressing into a tendon, in the knot that ties a bundle of silver-green leaves to a ceiling beam. Tia does not think this as a thought. She thinks it as a feeling, a small, quiet pressure behind her sternum, like a breath held a moment too long. And then she lets it go, because the ointment is fresh and cool on her skin, and Merritt is giving her a new pot, a larger one this time, and the same instructions, with one addition, Soak the hand in warm water with a pinch of salt each morning before beginning work. She pays. She thanks merit briefly, in the manner of two women who have conducted a professional exchange and found it satisfactory. She steps into the late afternoon street and walks home through the narrowing lanes of Rakotis, her treated hand held loosely at her side, the fingers opening and closing gently against the cooling air, testing themselves, finding that tonight the pain has taken a small step backward and the work tomorrow will be possible again. The autumn is not far off now. Already the light has a different quality in the mornings, thinner, more slanted, the summer's fullness beginning to drain away at the edges. The merchant fleet will return from the Red Sea soon, carrying the year's richest cargo, and the harbor will fill with ships from India and Arabia, and the library's shelves will receive another season's harvest of the world's written knowledge, confiscated and copied and classified and shelved, and the city will go on being what it has always been, a place where everything arrives and nothing is refused, and the question is never whether to take it in, but only where to put it and what to call it, and whether the name you give a thing can ever hold the whole of what it is. The ships come home with the turning of the season. For months they have been gone, south through the canal to the Nile, then east overland to the Red Sea ports of Berenice and Myos Hormos, and from there out into the open water, riding the summer monsoon winds toward Arabia and India and the coasts of East Africa. Now the monsoon has reversed, and the winds blow them back, and the cargo they carry is the distilled wealth of half the world. Let us follow them home. The first sign is not sight, but smell. Days before the autumn fleet rounds the Pharos lighthouse, the wind off the sea begins to carry something new, a warmth beneath the salt, a sweetness that does not belong to the Mediterranean. It is the ghost of cinnamon, the memory of frankincense, the faintest suggestion of pepper and cardamom and clove, carried in the holds of ships still miles from shore, but already breathing their cargo into the air. The dock workers notice it first. The harbor pilots who row out to guide the ships through the eastern channel notice it. And then the whole city seems to lean toward the water, the way a body leans toward a fire on a cold night, drawn by something older than thought. Doros is on the stone wharf before dawn on the morning the first ships arrive. He has been doing this work for nearly 15 years, boarding vessels, inspecting their cargo for manuscripts and documents, executing the royal confiscation decree that feeds the library's hunger, and still the autumn fleet makes him feel like a young man. The energy of it, the sheer quantity of the world arriving at one narrow harbor mouth. He stands on the quay in the blue half-light, dressed for work, a short linen chiton belted at the waist, sandals worn smooth by salt water and stone, the leather satchel slung across his chest that holds his wax tablets and stylus, and the small bronze seal that marks a confiscation as official. The air is cool enough that he can see his own breath, but it will not last. By mid-morning, the docks will be a press of bodies and noise and heat, and the autumn light, thinner now, more golden than the summer's white blaze, will slant across the harbor like honey poured from a height. The first ship to dock is a broad-bellied merchant vessel out of Berenice, her hull dark with pitch, her rigging salt-stiffened, her deck crowded with amphorae and bales and wooden crates lashed down with rope. The smell hits Doros as the gangplank drops, frankincense thick and resinous, so concentrated it feels almost solid in the nostrils, layered beneath it the drier sweetness of myrrh, and beneath that the particular organic warmth of raw cotton still in its bales, and something else, something sharper and more exotic that he cannot immediately name. The captain is a man Doros has dealt with before, a Greek from Rhodes who sails the monsoon route every year and returns each autumn a little more weathered and a little more prosperous. They greet each other with the easy familiarity of men who have done business together often enough to skip the formalities. The cargo manifest is long. Doros does not care about the frankincense or the cotton or the ivory tusks stacked like pale logs in the hold. He is looking for documents. The captain, who knows the routine, leads him to a compartment near the stern where the ship's records are kept alongside a small collection of materials acquired along the route. Trade agreements written on leather, a set of Persian astronomical texts on papyrus, and something Doros has not seen before, a bundle of long, narrow strips that are not papyrus at all, but some kind of dried leaf, inscribed with a dark ink in a script he does not recognize. The captain says they came from an Indian merchant at the port of Muziris on the Malabar coast. He says the merchant called them important. He does not know what they contain. Doros holds one of the palm leaf strips up to the light. The script is precise and regular, clearly the work of a trained hand, but he cannot read a single character. He turns the strip over. The back is blank. The leaf has been dried and treated with something, perhaps oil, to make it flexible, and it has a faint, sweet smell, like dried grass after rain. He sets it down carefully. He confiscates the Persian astronomical texts. These are clearly literary works and fall under the decree, and after a moment's thought, confiscates the palm leaf strips as well. The captain does not protest. He knows how this works. He will receive copies of the Greek texts within the week, and the palm leaves, well, one cannot copy what one cannot read, and the captain seems content to let them go in exchange for the smooth passage of his other business through the port authority. Doros wraps the confiscated materials in a linen cloth, seals the bundle with his bronze stamp pressed into a daub of beeswax, and hands it to a runner, a boy of 12 or 13 who works the route between the harbor and the library 3 or 4 times a day during the busy season. The boy tucks the bundle under his arm and disappears into the crowd. Doros watches him go, then turns back to the next ship. By mid-morning he has boarded 6 vessels. The quays are alive, sailors shouting in Aramaic and Greek and languages Doros cannot identify, stevedores hauling crates on their shoulders, merchants arguing over weights and prices, donkeys braying under loads of grain sacks, the creak of rigging and the slap of water against stone and the ceaseless layered roar of a harbor that never truly rests. Amphorae of wine from the Aegean islands are being unloaded alongside sacks of cinnamon bark from beyond India. Bolts of Indian cotton, softer and lighter than Egyptian linen, and increasingly popular in the city's textile markets, are stacked on wooden pallets. The world funnels through this harbor. Everything converges here and then disperses into the city, into workshops and warehouses and temples and homes, and some small fraction of it, the written fraction, the fragment that carries knowledge in marks on a surface, funnels further still through the streets and up the hill and through the palace walls and into the library, where it will be copied, classified, shelved, and preserved against the slow rot of time and the salt air and the appetites of mice. Doros takes a break at midday. He sits on the stone seawall with his legs dangling over the water, eating bread and salted fish and a handful of dried chickpeas, watching the ships settle at their moorings. He is tired but satisfied, the clean fatigue of physical work accomplished. A fellow dock agent sits beside him, and they share the comfortable silence of colleagues who have earned their rest. After a while, Doros mentions that he confiscated something strange today. Leaf strips with foreign writing, Indian maybe. His colleague shrugs. Everything strange ends up at the library eventually, he says. Doros nods. He thinks about Nicandros, somewhere up in the stacks, receiving this autumn's harvest. He thinks about dragging his friend out for a drink soon. Nicandros has been distant lately, absorbed in some cataloging problem he cannot quite explain, and Doros has the instinct, honed over 20 years of friendship, that the man needs to eat something that is not refectory bread and talk to someone who does not care about classification systems. Let us leave Doros at the harbor wall and follow the runner's path. The boy with the linen bundle has already delivered his cargo. The confiscated materials have been received, logged, and distributed to the appropriate departments for assessment. The Persian astronomical texts go to a scholar who reads Persian. There are 2 in residence at the Moussion this year, both elderly, both particular about their workspace conditions. The palm leaf strips go nowhere initially because no one can read them. They sit on a sorting table for 2 days before someone thinks to show them to a visiting Indian merchant who sometimes consults at the library on matters of Eastern trade routes, and the merchant identifies the script as Brahmi but cannot read it fluently enough to translate. The strips are labeled Indian Unread Autumn Acquisition and placed in a holding bin where they will wait for a translator who may or may not arrive. And among the other autumn acquisitions, the routine copies of Greek texts confiscated from Aegean trading ships, the Egyptian temple records purchased by book agents traveling the Nile, the Babylonian cuneiform tablets, whose clay surfaces resist the humidity better than any papyrus. Nicandros finds himself standing before the sorting table at the end of a long day, looking at a collection of the world's knowledge that exceeds, once again, his capacity to organize it. The Persian texts he can manage. There are existing categories, existing cross-references, existing scholars who will tell him where they belong. But the palm leaf strips defeat him entirely. He picks one up, turns it over in his hands, feels the strange texture of the dried leaf, the precision of the unknown script, and sets it down again. He labels the bin and moves on. It is the only reasonable thing to do. The system works because it moves forward. But tonight, walking the peripatos in the last of the autumn light, the columns casting long shadows, the sea turning copper in the west, he carries the feeling of those strips like a weight in his chest. Not guilt exactly, not failure, something more like awareness that the library's great nets, cast so wide and hauled in so relentlessly, catch everything and hold almost everything and understand only a fraction of what they contain, and that his life's work is the tending of those nets, and that the nets are magnificent, and that the sea beneath them is larger than any net could ever be. And meanwhile, on the way from the harbor to the library, if one were to pass through the edge of Rakotis on one of the smaller streets that branch off the main grid, the streets where the language shifts to demotic and the air carries the smell of bread ovens and bone dust, one might pause at the doorway of a narrow workshop and see, inside, a woman working. She is perhaps 70 years old, perhaps older, small, with the careful posture of someone who has spent a lifetime doing precise things with her hands. Her name is Isha, and her workshop smells of bone dust and beeswax and the faintest sweetness of hippopotamus ivory. She is carving a scroll case, cylindrical, the length of a forearm, and her hands knotted at the knuckles, the tendons visible beneath skin gone thin with age, move with a precision that seems impossible for hands so worn. Each cut is shallow, controlled, exact. The ivory shavings curl away from her graver and fall to the floor like tiny scrolls themselves, catching the lamplight. Her workshop holds the evidence of decades. Bone pen handles polished to a warm sheen, decorative inlays, sonnet pieces burnished smooth as water. On a high shelf, wrapped in linen, a set of the curved protective wands carved with bess and toweret, the same kind that sits in Merritt's workshop, carried by midwives and healers for generations. Eshe carves them still, though fewer people commission them now. The library and its scholars need containers for their knowledge, and she provides them, bone and ivory vessels to hold the papyrus rolls. She does not think about it in those terms. She thinks about the grain of the material, the angle of the cut, the way the ivory gives under her blade with a resistance that is not quite like anything else, harder than bone, softer than stone, warm in a way that dead material should not be warm, but always is. The autumn light moves across her floor. The scrolls accumulate in their bins, and as she carves, and the world turns around her work the way water turns around a stone in a stream, not because the stone commands the water, but because it is there and has been there and will be there still when the current has long passed by. The autumn deepens across Alexandria, and the city eases into its gentlest season. The brutal summer heat has broken. The Mediterranean sends cooler air through the colonnaded avenues, and the evenings arrive earlier now, drawing soft blue shadows along the canopic way. The sailing season is winding toward its close. The last merchantmen are being loaded at the quays, their hulls heavy with Egyptian grain and linen bound for ports across the known world. Soon the winter winds will make the open sea too dangerous, and the harbor will grow quieter, and the city will turn inward toward its fires and its lamps and its long nights of conversation and prayer. Let us visit them one more time, quietly, as the day settles, and then we will let them be. Nicandros sits alone in the scroll storage room. The afternoon light enters from a high window and falls across the wooden pigeonholes in warm, slanting bands. He has been working since morning, but slowly, not with the focused urgency that once carried him through entire days without pause, but with something more deliberate, more careful, as if he were memorizing the texture of the work rather than simply performing it. A scroll lies open on his reading table. It is nothing unusual, a copy of Hesiod, well preserved, the ink still sharp and black on pale papyrus. He has classified 1,000 texts like it, but today he reads a few lines before shelving it, letting the language move through him rather than past him. The Greek is old-fashioned, the rhythms of a world that existed before Alexandria was even imagined, before this library or its hunger for completeness was dreamed of. He reads about the turning of the seasons, the labor of the fields, the knowledge that lives in the hands of farmers and shepherds. Then he rolls the scroll carefully, left rod to right, the way it should be left for the next reader, and places it in its bin. He pauses, his ink-stained fingers resting on the wooden lip of the shelf, and looks down the long row of pigeonholes stretching away into dimness. Thousands of scrolls, tens of thousands, each one carrying a voice, each one reduced by necessity to a label and a first line and a position in the order. He is not unhappy. He does not regret the life he has spent here, but something in him has shifted, a loosening, the way soil loosens after rain, and he finds himself thinking more often of the texts he cannot classify, the ones that resist his system, the ones that carry knowledge in shapes his categories were not built to hold. He has not spoken to T about this. He would not know how to begin. But when her translations arrive at his desk now, he reads them more carefully than he once did, and he notices the small choices she makes, the places where she preserves an Egyptian term in transliteration rather than forcing it into Greek, the marginal notes she adds in her fine hand, pointing toward meanings the translation cannot contain. He has begun to leave her cross-reference notations that are slightly more expansive than the system requires. An extra line describing context, a note on the text's original use. It is a small thing, a gesture made in ink between two people who share a problem neither has named aloud. It will not change the library. It will not reshape the Pinakes or alter the order of the shelves. But it is a crack through which something true passes, and for Nicandros that is enough. It is perhaps more than he expected from this year and from himself. He rises from his table, stretches his back, the old forward hunch protesting, as it always does, and walks out along the peripatos. The columns frame the harbor in panels of fading gold. He can smell the sea, and beneath it the dry, grassy scent of the papyrus stacks behind him, and beneath that the faintest trace of lamp oil from the reading rooms where the evening scholars are already beginning their work. He stands in the colonnade and breathes, and the city moves around him, the creak of rigging, the murmur of voices, the distant call of a priest beginning the evening liturgy at the Serapeum. And he lets it all exist without trying to classify any of it. Down in Rakotis, Merit is closing her workshop for the day. She banks the small clay oven in the courtyard, covers the jars of prepared medicines with linen cloths, and hangs a fresh bundle of thyme from the ceiling beam where the old one has dried to a whisper. The household altar receives its evening offering, a piece of bread, a splash of beer poured from a clay cup, and she murmurs the words she has murmured every evening for decades, the formula her teacher Tanifret taught her, the one that asks Bess and Taweret to watch over the house through the night. The words are worn smooth with use, the way a stone step is worn by feet, and they carry no dramatic weight. They are simply part of the close of the day, as natural as banking the fire or covering the jars. But they also carry, in their familiar rhythm, the accumulated faith of generations, the quiet, persistent belief that the world is watched over, that the vulnerable are guarded, that there are forces older than any library or any king who care about the health of a sleeping child, the safety of a laboring mother, the small, persistent life of a neighborhood healer in a city that barely knows she exists. She sits for a moment in her courtyard as the last light fades. The stars are beginning to appear above the rooftops. In a few weeks, Tia will come to her door again, not for her hand this time, but with a question about a plant whose demotic name does not appear in any text the library holds. Merit will answer, and then she will ask a question of her own about what exactly Tia does all day with those scrolls. And the conversation that follows will last longer than either of them expects, but that is a story for another evening. Tonight, Merit simply sits and breathes and watches the stars come out over Alexandria, and the weariness in her hands is the good weariness that comes from a day of useful work, and the bread on the altar will be stale by morning, and that is how it should be. In the harbor district, Doros is walking home along the canal. His leather satchel is empty, the day's confiscations long since dispatched to the library, the wax tablets wiped clean, the work done. He passes a tavern and considers stopping, but the evening is too fine to spend indoors. The canal water catches the last of the light, a pale bronze ribbon winding between the warehouses. He can hear from somewhere across the water the sound of a flute, an olos, its double reeds producing that slightly nasal, slightly mournful tone that seems to belong to Alexandria the way the salt air belongs to it. He does not know who is playing. A sailor, perhaps, or a dock worker's daughter, or someone sitting alone on a rooftop as the world dims. It does not matter. The music hangs in the warm air, and Doros walks beneath it unhurried, a man who has done his work and earned his rest, and who carries no questions heavier than whether the tavern near his lodgings will have fresh fish tonight. He thinks of Nicandros briefly. He should drag the man out again soon, before the winter makes him burrow even deeper into his stacks. He will, next week, perhaps. The thought is easy, affectionate, a habit of friendship that requires no effort, only the willingness to show up. And T.A. is at her stall. The chickpea woman is ladling the last cakes from the oil, golden, fragrant, dusted with cumin. T.A. takes hers in a fig leaf, as she always does, and stands at the edge of the canal, eating slowly, watching the light leave the water. Her right hand aches faintly. It always aches now, a dull companion she has learned to accommodate, the way one accommodates a door that sticks or a step that creaks. The ointment helps. Merit's fingers, pressing into the knotted tendons, help more. The work goes on. She thinks about the text she translated today, a fragment this time, incomplete, the ending lost to rot or rats or the simple passage of time. It was a letter, not a treatise, a woman writing to her sister in another city, describing a remedy for a child's fever, and then, in the same line, asking whether the barley harvest had come in well. The two subjects were not separated. The health of a child and the health of a field existed in the same sentence, in the same breath, as part of the same fabric. Tia translated it all, including the barley. She does not know if anyone will ever read her translation. The fragment was minor, unattributed, the kind of text that fills a bin but earns no cross-reference in the Pinakes. But she translated it with the same careful hand she gives everything, because the woman who wrote it, whoever she was, wherever she lived, however many centuries ago, deserved to have her words carried accurately into a language she never spoke. The fig leaf is empty. The oil is on T.A.'s fingers. The canal is dark now, the last bronze gone from the water, and the stars are coming out, the same stars that Eratosthenes measures from the Mausion's observatory, the same stars that the Decan calendars track across the Egyptian sky, the same stars that a woman in Upper Egypt watched while writing to her sister about barley and fever and the ordinary continuance of life. T.A. walks home. Her father will have left a lamp burning for her, The altar will be there in its corner, Bes, Taweret, Bastet, the Wedjat eye, silent, attended, unchanged. She will sleep, and in the morning she will rise and walk north through the grid of streets to the library, and the work will continue. The city sleeps in stages, the way all great cities do. The harbor first, as the last ships are secured and the dock workers drift away. Then the markets, as the stalls are shuttered and the unsold fish is carried to the cats who wait in the shadows, sacred and patient. Then the residential quarters, lamp by lamp, door by door, the sounds thinning from conversation to murmur to silence. The temples are the last to quiet. The Serapeum, where the hybrid god sits in his darkened hall, the incense still smoldering. The smaller shrines of Isis and Thoth and Bastet, where a priest or priestess performs the closing rites by oil lamp, folding the linen cloths, covering the offerings, speaking the words that seal the boundary between waking and sleep. In the Mausion, a single lamp burns in the scroll storage room. No one is there. The light flickers across the rows of pigeonholes, each one holding its cargo of rolled papyrus, voices from Athens, from Memphis, from Babylon, from Jerusalem, from villages whose names survive only because someone once wrote them down. The painted labels glow faintly in the lamplight. Names, subjects, first lines. The smell of papyrus, dry, grassy, faintly sweet, fills the room like breath. The scrolls do not know they are classified. The knowledge inside them does not know it has been sorted and shelved and cross-referenced and sometimes inevitably reduced. It simply waits, as knowledge does, for the next hand to unroll it, the next voice to read it aloud into the warm air of a city that was built to hold the world's memory and could not, in the end, hold even its own. But that is the future, and it is far away, and tonight the lamp burns and the scrolls are safe, and the people who tend them are sleeping in their separate quarters of this extraordinary, imperfect, radiant city. Nicandros sleeps in his narrow room in the Mausion, the forward hunch of his shoulders easing as his body settles, his ink-stained fingers relaxed against the linen sheet. Merit sleeps in Rakotis, Bes and Taweret keeping their vigil in the corner, the smell of time in the air. Doros sleeps near the canal, dreamless, content, his satchel hung on a peg by the door. Eshe sleeps in her workshop, as she has for years, her tools laid out for morning, the ivory warm in the dark. And Tie sleeps in her father's house, her aching hand cradled against her chest, and somewhere in the library, a scroll she translated today sits in its bin, waiting. A woman's letter to her sister, carried from one language to another by a young woman who understood that the smallest voice deserves safe passage. The lamp in the storage room gutters and dims. The harbor water laps against the quays. The lighthouse beam turns, slow and steady, sweeping its pale arm across the dark water and the sleeping ships and the city that lies between the sea and the lake, between the Greek world and the Egyptian one, between the knowledge that can be written down and the knowledge that can only be lived. Let it turn. Let the light sweep on. Let the city rest.